This presentation is a recorded version of a presentation for healthcare customers. It's also applicable to other regulated industry customers and is probably a good review of some different security and architectural considerations for Power BI customers in general. The topic is planning for a secure and scalable business intelligence data estate, and it was recorded on June 22nd, 2021. Now, when we talk about sensitive data, what is the scope of that term? Generally, within the context of this presentation, what it's referring to is PHI, protected health information, PII, personally identifiable information, PIFI, which is personally identifiable financial information, and data that can lead to securities fraud or data that contains company IP or competitive information. In short, it's data that you either want to filter for specific people within your organization so they only see certain things, or it's also data that you want to block external people from being able to access because it could either violate privacy laws or potentially compromise company intellectual property or information for competitive purposes. So the presentation today is going to focus on tools, specifically tools around Power BI, on how you can control access to this type of data. We'll not be diving into specifics about any policies or laws or anything like that. Here's the high-level agenda. And starting here with the Power BI platform security overview, along with some links. So just at a high level, Power BI has a lot of different certifications. There's a link you can go to in order to see what all of those are. In healthcare, HIPAA, high tech, high trust, all of those sorts of things. Also, there's some Power BI security white papers out there. We have a link here, which is taking you to the official Power BI security white paper. Then there's also additional white papers that relate to this topic. So things about GDPR, multi-geo, premium, those sorts of things. So first, let's start with some of the tools that your users will be using with Power BI that you may want to consider securing. First of all, Power BI Desktop is updated monthly. It can be downloaded for free by anyone, anywhere from the public internet. However, on company machines, you can control access to that piece of software using the Microsoft Store, also third-party tools. And these updates will continue to roll out monthly, so it's something that you might want to consider having a policy in place. As of right now, the folks who will need Power BI Desktop are people who are actually developing data sets for Power BI, and also some people who are using some of the advanced report configuration controls. You can build reports in the service. The ability to do so continues to get better all the time, but there will be users that still need desktop to do certain things. Next is the Power BI, which are also the Power Platform gateways. The same piece of gateway software is used for both solution suites. And in a nutshell, what the gateway does is gives you a secure connection outside of Azure to other sources. They may be on-prem, they may be in other clouds, and the gateways do also periodically update. So I'd highly recommend that you have at least one prod and at least one dev gateway. So when the updates happen, you can test the upgrade process, make sure everything goes smoothly, have that be part of your process to keep everything up and running. The gateways are usually deployed on a VM or a proxy server. There's also a concept called personal gateways, where users can deploy a gateway which gives them a connection from their personal machine to the cloud. There are use cases where power users will want to use those personal gateways. Some organizations do like to lock down control to those personal gateways just because they want to completely control any connectivity from machines to the cloud. So that's up to you how you want to control that. Next, looking at mobile devices, Power BI has mobile apps for iPhone, iPad, Droid, Windows 10. There are products that Microsoft makes that can be used to control what kind of content is available on those apps and what's happening with those apps. Those products include Microsoft Intune to control mobile device management and mobile app management, and also we'll talk a little bit later about Microsoft Cloud App Security and also Microsoft Information Protection. So best practices, takeaways for securing those Power BI tools. Be aware that you'll be managing versions of Power BI Desktop. It's best to have everybody on the same version. Have more than one gateway so you can test the upgrade process. Keep the gateways updated, and consider some sort of mobile device strategy if you want your employees to be able to access their reports from their mobile devices. Some additional Power BI tools that you may want to consider. These are tools that not everybody uses, but there will be users who still want to use these. First of all, if you're using the Excel integration with Power BI, you can either connect to Power BI from Excel and use data from Power BI within Excel, or you can actually publish Excel content up to Power BI and include it within Power BI apps that will require the Office 365 version of Excel. So that's something to be aware of. There's also a Power BI app for desktop that a lot of people don't know about. It's kind of under the radar a little bit, but this will allow you to do things like kiosks, where it can have a scrolling screen that's intended to be a kiosk, maybe up on a flat screen on the wall. This is not the same as Power BI Desktop, and it might be something that you want to manage access to. Also, Power BI Report Builder. Report Builder is taking a tried and true technology, paginated reports, which has been around for a long time. I've personally been using it since 2008 with SSRS. And you can now publish those reports up to Power BI. That is a separate tool similar to Power BI Desktop, but it's Power BI Report Builder. Generally, this is a smaller subset of users that will be using this tool, and you may want to consider making it available to them. It's especially good for, if you want to print out 40 pages of data or have pixel perfect PDFs, those sorts of things. Some other tools that customers commonly use, one would be DAX Studio. This allows you to look at things like query patterns and test queries against a data set. Vertipack Analyzer, which allows you to look at data sets and understand the compression and what's happening, how big different tables are and how big each column is, and start performance tuning things within your model and find out what's causing things like bloat of the total size of the model. There's ALM Toolkit, which looks at changes that are happening at data sets and detects those changes for lifecycle management. And then also Tabular Editor. Tabular Editor is for power users who want to have more fine-grained control over their data sets and be able to do things like object level security and calculation groups. It is a power user tool. You probably don't want to give it to everybody, and it's something that gives you a lot of power over that data set, but it does require some training to learn how to use it. It's not as business user friendly as a tool like Power BI Desktop. So you may want to consider these additional tools and control access to those tools within your environment. Next, identities within Power BI are all controlled using Azure Active Directory. So I thought it would be helpful to review Azure Active Directory and security groups. There's different types of groups that you can use to control access in Power BI. As a general best practice, I'd recommend using security groups or Microsoft 365 groups. Reason being is if you're using a product like Teams or other Office 365 products, the M365 groups are often used to determine who's a member of that team, and then you can reuse that M365 group within Power BI to make sure that that team has access to the team's content. So you have a single group, an M365, to manage access for everybody. If there's a large number of people in the group, it eliminates the need to manually add and remove people at the Power BI layer. That can be done at the M365 layer. Also, security groups can be used. In particular, this is useful for when you're not tying a workspace or using content from a workspace directly with a team and Teams. So things like shared and certified data sets, shared data flows. If you're doing dev test prod with deployment pipelines, the dev and test groups may be managed with the security group. So generally, I'd recommend using those two, but there are some other options for niche use cases. Now I'm going to walk through a few slides with examples of how that architecture might look for different types of teams that are doing things within Power BI. The first is a simple business architecture where you just give a group of business users a single workspace. They do everything right in that workspace, and then they might publish an app for their own use or to a group of read-only users. The next is if you have dev test prod using something like deployment pipelines, and that still is very easy for business users to use, very straightforward. And then also a cross workspace architecture, which would be more of an advanced IT type deployment. And this can be useful when you're dealing with sensitive data because you can scrub sensitive data from things like data flows and then share them with users. And if the data is scrubbed, the users will not have access to sensitive data. You can also have shared and certified data sets where you ensure that things like row level security and object level security are properly implemented by your expertly trained IT team. And then the users who are using those data sets and reports, first of all, they're reusing a single source of data, so you're not duplicating data and creating sprawl, but the row level security and object level security will persist through their solutions to ensure that based on somebody's Azure Active Directory identity, they see what they're supposed to see and nothing else. Finally, I did list Power BI apps just because this is kind of a subset of workspaces, so I thought it would be important to add to this list. But an app can be created from a workspace and distributed to users so that they can have read-only access. So the first option, the simple business architecture, is just giving a workspace to a group of users. And then if they want to, they can create an app which is used for read-only purposes, which would be the yellow user there, user C. User A and B are green because they have access to Workspace A, and user D is red because they do not have access based on their Azure Active Directory identity. And in that workspace, they can have all of their data sets, data flows, their reports, their dashboards, their Excel workbooks, and their Power BI goals scorecards. Now, the next option adds a little bit of complexity. This is where you have deployment pipelines. And what you'll notice here is that there's three workspaces, A, B, and C, dev, test, and prod. And in the dev and test workspaces, user B, who's a developer, might have access to publish and change content. But then in the production workspace, only the admin has permission to update content and to deploy to the app. So you're preventing some of the more junior users of your team from potentially pushing changes to prod that might break something. And down at the bottom, you'll also see that that prod workspace, you could secure that using individual users, security groups, or Microsoft 365 groups. The M365 group is great if it's a group that's also using Teams. But then in those lower layers, the dev and test layers, that's more where it might just be a couple of users, so you don't want to bother with creating a group at all. Or you could use a security group because they're probably not going to have a separate team in order to discuss things in just dev or just test. Now let's move to the third example, the more advanced, what I would call IT level example, which is cross workspace architectures. So you'll see what we've added here is two additional workspaces, D and E. D is shared data flows, and a couple reasons you might want to do this. One, it'll reduce the number of queries being sent back to the source. So if you have something like date tables, time tables, maybe code tables that you use to filter things, you can just bring those in and cache them. And then when people are sending queries back to the source, they won't be sending them to the source for those specific tables. So you're reducing the stress on your source system. Also, there's shared and certified data sets. Power BI dataset is actually Azure Analysis Services under the hood. It's a full-blown tabular model, and it gives you the ability to create an expertly crafted data set that has security tools such as row level security and object level security implemented at that level. And then the users who are actually building reports and dashboards and things like that, they don't have to go build a data set. They can just query that data set and basically build the reports that they'd like to see. So the security will persist from that shared and certified data set. And additionally, you just have the data set there once. So as I mentioned earlier, you're preventing data duplication and sprawl. Next, we'll move to build, read, and reshare dataset permissions. So this is something which I've been getting a lot of questions about lately. There's some fine-grained permissions that you can assign to datasets that allow you to have additional control over the security of those datasets. I put a link that you'll probably want to review if you want to dive into this. Effectively, these permissions are they all do something a little bit different. They're not really additive. So read permission, this gives users the ability to actually view the content within a data set. You can still apply role level security and object level security, and it will filter for that too. So let's say that somebody accidentally gets read permissions, but they're not allowed to view any data based on role level security or object level security. That person will either see a blank report or some sort of error as that secondary layer of data security. Reshare permissions. This gives a user the ability to reshare the ability to view the data set with other people. So that's an important one. And then build permission. This is in addition to read and reshare, and it gives users the ability to actually create reports and dashboards and other types of content on top of that data set. So build and reshare could be combined so that somebody could use a shared and certified data set to create a new report on top of it and then share it with another group. Build is required for cross-workspace development, for analyzing Excel, and for some of the external tools also. So best practice I'd note there, as mentioned, is that if you're going to give users build and reshare, having RLS and OLS on the data set can give you another layer of security in case permissions get accidentally shared with the wrong person. Next, let's talk about My Workspace. My Workspace is a workspace that every Power BI user has access to, and it's intended to be a sandbox for learning, testing, and exploration. So if somebody's taking a free dashboard in a day class, that's a scenario where they can publish that content up to My Workspace and see how it looks and works in the cloud without having to actually buy a license. They can do that with a Power BI free license. So free users, or the free license I just referenced, means that somebody does not have a paid license and they can still use My Workspace, but they cannot share content with anyone else. Think of it as a personal OneDrive where you can't share content with other people. It's for their eyes only, and it's really just a sandbox for learning. Now, Pro and E5 users also have Pro licenses. They can share content with other Pro or E5 users, and they can share it from My Workspace. However, they can't share content with free users. And I want to add as a caveat there that that's assuming that My Workspace has not been added to Premium. But because My Workspace is not a Premium workspace, the Pro users cannot share content with free users by default. Sharing and resharing to new users does require a Pro license. Free users can share links with users who already have access to the content. And you can also disable resharing and build permissions as mentioned in one of the previous slides. Now let's move on to row level security. Generally, I like to classify the row level security options into 3 different architectures. The first is using roles and rules. This is the easiest way to do RLS. This actually gets built within Power BI Desktop, and you use DAX expressions to determine what the different groupings are of filtering. So an example of that would be, let's say your team has an East, a Central, and a West division, and the people in each division are only allowed to see the data for their division. You could create a DAX expression that filters for East, and that would be the group called East. Likewise, you could do the same for Central and West. Then when you publish to the service, you can assign users and security groups to those divisions. Very easy to implement, but if there gets to be a large number of complex groupings, then it doesn't always scale well. In that case, you'd want to look at dynamic row level security. And with dynamic row level security, you would actually use a table of data that maps individual people to categories or other rows of data. It's a little bit more complicated to implement, but it also gives you more flexibility. So for example, if a manager can see the data for all of their employees, but their employees can only see their own data, But occasionally, when that manager goes on vacation, another manager can see those employees' data. With a row-level security table, you can configure those changes and configure those complexities into the table. Additionally, with a row-level security table, you can often reuse that table if you're doing row-level security at the source, which is the third option. So RLS at the source allows you to pass the user's identity, their Azure Active Directory identity, to the source so that you can use single sign-on when the user is looking at a report or some sort of content in order to determine their identity, and then the filtering or the security can happen at the source rather than within Power BI. So Power BI is just acting as a query generation tool, and it's sending queries that contain the user's identity, and then you can do the filtering at the source. So let's walk through an example of that first architecture using roles and rules. This is the simple one. So in this example, when building the Power BI data set in Power BI Desktop, a user can set up filter criteria, which then ensures that user A only sees oncology data, user B only sees pediatric data, but maybe there's an all group that sees everything, such as the CEO. Additionally, user C might not be able to see any data within the row-level security configuration. And then if somebody accidentally makes them a viewer of that report, they still won't see any of the data. So you have kind of a backup security layer there. The next option is using the dynamic row-level security. And with this option, the table will actually do the filtering. It's that table which maps individual users to categories or rows of data, and based on their user identity, it will filter the content that they're able to see. Effectively the same outcome, but you have the ability to implement much more complex rules into who sees what. And then thirdly, you could even reuse that same security table if you're also doing single sign-on and direct query to some of your sources. And this slide just shows how you can actually combine row-level security within Power BI and row-level security at the source. This would be an example that you commonly see in healthcare, where let's say a provider is looking at their dashboard and they see summary level data for 21 patients in their department. Row-level security will filter it down to just their department, so they only see their own department, and that's row-level security within Power BI. But let's say they want to drill to detail and see some detail leveled information. Well, you could configure the drill to detail using what's called a composite model within Power BI in order to send that query back to the source. And there might be single sign-on row-level security configured at the source. So when you drill to detail, that provider might only see the 8 patients who are their patients. So at a summary level, they can see how the department's doing, drill to detail, use a different type of RLS in order to just see their own patients so that they're not seeing sensitive data for individuals who they're not supposed to see it for. Next, we'll talk a little bit about object level security. Object level security has been around in traditional analysis services for a long time. It's now available in Power BI. And with object level security, you can control access to tables of data, specific columns, and also to calculated measures. I have a few links there if you want to review. In order to enable object level security, you'll need to use Tabular Editor, which is one of the external tools. You can't do it as of right now in Power BI Desktop. And I'd like to add that object level security should be very carefully considered and very carefully implemented. I generally don't recommend using it as a way to filter data. It's more of a way to protect data so that certain users cannot see it. The reason I say that is if you put object level security on a column and put that column inside of a chart of a report, and somebody who's not allowed to see that column opens up that report, that chart will give them an error message. So they literally do not even have access to query that column. It's if it's not even there for them. This is another backup to another backup security layer if accidental sharing of content can happen. One other thing to note is that within Power BI, you can hide things like columns and tables and measures. That's not object level security. That's obscurity, not security. Custom queries could potentially still access that data. So real object level security within Tabular Editor is the way to go if you want to do OLS. Next, let's take a look at data source credentials, single sign-on versus stored. So with Power BI import models or import tables, the process by which to update that cache uses stored credentials. It could be stored credentials of the user or maybe a service account, but it's actually caching data that uses a specific identity to go get that data. If the cache has sensitive data, that's where you can use either Power BI row level security and object level security. You could potentially also just not import the sensitive data. So maybe you have a table of information where some of the columns are sensitive. You could create data flows, pull those into Power BI, and then the sensitive data is not there. So when the business users use a data flow to create a data set, they don't have access to the sensitive data. Now, if you're using direct query to the source, Power BI supports single sign-on for some sources. I have a link to a list of different sources that are supported. And what single sign-on does is it takes the user's Azure Active Directory username or user principal name and can pass it or pass a portion of it to the source so that security can be configured at the source. You can also do direct query with stored credentials, so that's something that you may want to consider. You could do direct query with stored credentials against the source, and then also use Power BI row level security with the direct query solution. So it's kind of up to you how you want to use those different options. I do not recommend using direct query specifically because it can do SSO. With direct query, remember you're passing queries back to the source. And if you have a lot of people using these reports, and every time you click a button, it generates 10 queries and 10 people are using it at the same time, that's potentially 100 concurrent queries getting passed back to the source. When using Power BI import tables and data sets, they can handle that type of concurrency. It's designed for that purpose. But when you're doing direct query against a source, it can overwhelm those direct query sources pretty quickly when you're sending hundreds of queries at them. And it can also get very expensive to upsize relational database sources to handle that type of processing. Next, let's overview data protection, Microsoft Information Protection, and Microsoft Cloud App Security. So these capabilities allow you to classify and label sensitive data in Power BI. I'll walk through a couple of examples in these slides, but effectively you could label a data set as having something like PHI, and in that case, it may do a couple different things. It may prevent users from exporting data from that data set. You could use it to tag exports from Power BI so that only people with permission to view that PHI can open the Excel or PowerPoint or PDF that gets exported. And then you can also monitor users and activities and control what's available on controlled devices versus uncontrolled devices, those sorts of things. And just kind of as a summary here, you can apply those labels and they cross beyond Power BI into Office 365 and things like Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Outlook and things you might use in Teams. You can add additional governance policies to your Power BI data. It can allow you to better meet regulatory requirements by having oversight of how that sensitive data is being used, so you can still leverage your data and allow users access to the data rather than having to absolutely block all types of reporting. And then the Cloud App Security also gives you some real-time monitoring capabilities. So with Microsoft Information Protection, once it's set up, it's very easy to add it to Power BI. And when you do that, it changes the sensitivity label for an object such as a data set, or in this case, a report. Now, these sensitivity labels persist in exported documents, and this is something which is it's a special capability. So when somebody actually exports something to Excel, it will persist that security tag so that if they take that Excel workbook and they email it to somebody who's not supposed to see that data, that person will not be able to open that workbook. And administrators can also closely monitor risky sessions connecting to Power BI services using the Cloud App Security. So this gives you the ability to kind of control what's happening on your kind of enterprise controlled devices versus mobile devices. Additionally, the Power BI admins have visibility to that sensitive data and how it's being used and who's using it. And so let's move on to virtual network gateways and private links. So with these two features, which are still relatively new for Power BI, you can secure both inbound and outbound connectivity. I provided a couple links if you want to go read about more details. It does add a little bit of complexity to solutions, but gives you that extra layer of control. If we were to look at a vNet, the virtual network gateway, it's currently supported with several different Azure sources. You can use a traditional gateway if you're connecting outside of Azure. This is a virtual gateway within Azure. It does eliminate the need for an on-prem data gateway if you want that fine-grained control over connectivity. And it is important to note that it's still in public preview. So you can go ahead, test it out, provide feedback, see what you think, but it's not officially GA as of right now. Now let's take a look at Azure Data Lake integration. So Power BI data flows are a full-blown ETL, ELT tool that are part of your Power BI suite, and it comes with your Power BI licensing. And data flows stores data under the hood in an Azure data lake. So it's actually doing ETL, ELT, and storing that data in a data lake. And if you want to, you can configure the data lake so that admins can go get access to all of the tables of data in a data lake. Also, at the level of an individual workspace, that workspace team could assign a data lake to the data flows within their workspace in order to access that data outside of Power BI. Why is this important? It gives you the ability to do ETL and ELT within Power BI and then pull the results of that data into external tools. So you're not locking your data inside of the Microsoft solution. As a best practice, you'll want to make sure that whoever can access these data lakes is approved to handle that data. So if there's sensitive data in your data flows, you want to make sure that whoever can view the data lakes has the know-how and training to handle that sensitive data. If I were to review an example of kind of what that looks like, an analyst can create a data flow to go get something like industry codes from a government source. Under the hood, it stores it in a data lake, and then either the analyst and their team or the IT admins can go get that data from the data lake. They could maybe use it for machine learning purposes to integrate with some ML models that then tie back into data flows. They could use it for building data sets, or they could even pull it into third-party tools for external efforts outside of Power BI. Also, with data sets, you can also access those from third-party tools. As I mentioned before, a data set is Azure Analysis Services under the hood, and when you're using Power BI Premium, you then have access to query those Azure Analysis Services tabular models with tools other than Power BI and Microsoft tools. Let's walk through a couple examples of sensitive data protection where having different layers of security can help out if mistakes are made. So the diagram on the left is kind of showing that there are different levels at which you can add security. And obviously the best way to secure sensitive data is at the source. The most secure way to secure sensitive data is don't let anybody ever use it or see it. You can also add access level security within Power BI so that certain people are allowed to see certain things. And then you can also add role level security and object level security so that two different people can see the same report, but they see different data from the underlying data set. And then there's also the use case of export. So when somebody says export to Excel, what happens to that file after they export it? So first of all, if sensitive data gets exported to Excel and you're using cloud app security or information protection, you can still use those tools to block people who aren't supposed to see that data from seeing it. It's a great way to prevent accidental sharing of sensitive data. Now let's say that role level security or object level security was broken or improperly implemented, or somehow somebody got access to something they weren't supposed to see. In that case, there's still a risk that an internal user might potentially see something they're not supposed to see. However, because you still need identity level access to get into Power BI, that should still protect an external user from being able to see something. Just because role level security is broken, there's still access level security at the next level down to prevent them from getting at that data. Effectively, external users would either need source level credentials at the source level database to go get sensitive data. Within Power BI, they'd need some sort of Azure Active Directory credential. MFA can also help mitigate that risk. Or if they get a file that's been exported from a solution, MIP could prevent them from being able to see that data in the export. Finally, let's review some security architectures using these different options that could be applied to different solutions in Power BI. So you'll see that I broke this grid into a couple different categories. These first four columns are the different types of artifacts that have data in them. The second column would be the permissions to those artifacts. The third column is looking at some different security capabilities that could be applied to these solutions. And then fourthly is the different personas and whether or not sensitive data would be protected for those personas. So if we look at the top option, with this option, there is sensitive data at the source. There is sensitive data that's been added to data flows. Then the data sets also have sensitive data, and therefore the reports are also going to have sensitive data. From a permissions perspective, the admins and the IT developers are the only folks who can access data flows. Likewise, they're the only folks who can share content. Now, despite the sensitive data, you can still allow data exports and secure accidental sharing using Cloud App Security and Microsoft Information Protection. Additionally, row-level security can ensure that the right users see the right data. So there is still a little bit of a risk that admins or devs could potentially share that sensitive data with people who aren't supposed to see it. But ideally, they'd be trained to handle that scenario. And unless the report viewers and users are taking screenshots or something like that, these tools should be able to protect sensitive data. Now, let's say we remove Cloud App Security. It might be because mobile access is not needed and the users are only going to be viewing things on specific devices. Let's also say we remove information protection. In that case, it might also be a good idea to turn off data exports for those solutions. So no exporting to Excel or exporting to PowerPoint, because those exports could potentially contain sensitive information, which is then no longer protected and could be sent to other people. If the solution does not have row-level security and object-level security, you're probably going to want to control who's able to see that report. And another option would be to potentially have sensitive information in the data flows, but then the development team might not pull the sensitive information into the data sets. Therefore, the reports will not have sensitive information, and you can give viewers and self-service users the ability to share and build things because there's no sensitive information in the content that they're able to access. We can take it one step further, and perhaps data flows is where you no longer include sensitive information. So you could remove that information from the data that's coming in from the source, and then at that point, the end users will still no longer have any access to sensitive information. This second to last option is basically just showing that if you don't have any sensitive information in the solution at all, then perhaps none of these tools are needed in order to share reports, and it makes things much easier. Then I added one final option down at the bottom, which is showing that if you're using direct query mode, where perhaps you're using single sign-on for row-level security, access level security, and object level security, in that case, you should still consider the data sets and reports to be sensitive, but the user identities will be used to filter that information, and the security will be handled at the source. So additional information about this presentation is available in the links below. Please let me know if there's any type of content along these lines which would be valuable to cover in the future. And please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll make sure that I route you to the appropriate resource at Microsoft.